The sky above Xal'kath 9 was a scarred, filthy wound, an open sore in the cosmos where the heavens bled fire and ash. Captain Draven Cormac didn't look up. There was nothing for him up there, just darkness and death. His eyes were fixed forward, cutting through the haze of smoke and debris that choked the battlefield. His breath came slow and steady inside his helmet, the sound of it like the rasp of metal on stone. Advance, Draven growled into the comms. The Iron Knights moved as one, a phalanx of armored giants with glowing swords, their blades humming with barely contained energy. They were death incarnate, the last hope of a humanity teetering on the edge of extinction. The Xal'kath were waiting for them. The alien bastards knew this was the endgame, and they'd thrown everything they had into the defense of their citadel. The ground shook with the weight of 1,000 alien feet, the air thick with the smell of ozone and charred flesh. Draven's vision was a red-tinged blur as the targeting systems in his helmet marked out the enemy in cold, clinical precision. Contact. Someone barked in his ear, and then the world was nothing but noise and blood. The Xal'kath came at them in a wave, a living tide of chitin and claws. Their shrieks tore through the air, a keening wail that drilled into Draven's skull. He met the first one head-on, his sword arcing through the air in a silver blur. The blade sliced clean through the alien's torso, spraying thick, black ichor across his visor. The Xal'kath dropped, twitching, its split body flopping to the ground with a wet slap. "Push forward," Draven shouted. His voice was hard, unyielding, cutting through the chaos like a blade. The Iron Knights surged behind him, their formation tightening, as they drove into the heart of the Xal'kath horde. Draven's world narrowed to the few feet of ground in front of him, the edge of his blade, the next target. There was no room for fear or doubt, only the next kill, the next step forward. He became a machine, every movement precise, efficient. His sword rose and fell, each strike lethal, each step driving them closer to the citadel walls. The aliens fought with a kind of animalistic fury, their bodies throwing themselves onto the Iron Knight's blades without hesitation, without fear. Draven cut down one after another, his sword a blur, his armor splattered with blood and alien fluids. His muscles burned, but he pushed the pain aside, focusing only on the task at hand. One of his men went down, a Xal'kath claw punching through his chest plate with a sickening crunch. Draven didn't pause, didn't look back. The fallen knight's screams cut off abruptly, swallowed by the cacophony of battle. The squad kept moving, their line unbroken, every man knowing that hesitation meant death. Ahead, the citadel loomed like a jagged tooth, its walls a grotesque mix of metal and organic matter, pulsing with a sickly green light. Draven's lips pulled back in a snarl, his teeth bared beneath his helmet. This was it. This was the end. They reached the base of the wall, and Draven drove his blade into the nearest Xal'kath, the tip of his sword exploding out of its back in a shower of gore. He yanked the blade free and slammed his gauntlet into a control panel on his wrist. A blast charge was already primed, stuck to the wall's surface by one of his men. "Clear," he shouted, and the Iron Knights ducked as the wall blew inward, a deafening roar that drowned out even the noise of battle. Chunks of metal and alien flesh rained down on them, and for a moment the world was nothing but dust and fire. When the smoke cleared, Draven was already on his feet, leading the charge through the breach. Inside the citadel, the air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, the walls wet and pulsing like the insides of a living thing. The Xal'kath were waiting, their eyes glowing in the dark, their bodies blending into the organic architecture. Draven didn't hesitate. His sword cut the first one down before it could scream, the blade carving a burning path through its chest. The rest of the Iron Knights followed, their swords blazing as they cut a swath through the alien defenders. It was brutal, bloody work, no mercy, no hesitation. They moved deeper into the citadel, the corridors narrowing, the walls closing in around them. Draven's focus was absolute, his mind a cold, hard blade. He didn't allow himself to think of the men they'd lost, of the ones who wouldn't make it out of this hellhole alive. All that mattered was the mission. Ahead, a massive figure stepped out of the shadows, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. The Xal'kath warlord. Draven's grip tightened on his sword, his heart pounding in his chest. The warlord was twice his size, its body armored in thick, chitinous plates, its hands gripping a massive, serrated blade. Draven raised his sword, the blade humming with lethal energy. The warlord let out a low, guttural growl, and then they were on each other, swords clashing in a burst of light and sparks. The impact sent a shockwave through Draven's body, but he held his ground, his teeth grinding together as he pushed back with all his strength. The warlord was a beast, its strikes heavy and relentless. Draven ducked beneath a swing that would have taken his head off and slashed at the creature's legs. His blade bit deep, and the warlord roared in pain, swinging wildly. Draven sidestepped and drove his sword into the creature's side, feeling the satisfying give of flesh beneath his blade. The warlord staggered, black ichor pouring from its wounds, but it didn't fall. Draven didn't give it the chance to recover. He yanked his sword free and brought it down in a brutal, overhead strike, the blade carving through the warlord's skull with a sickening crunch. The alien dropped to its knees, its body shuddering before it collapsed, dead at last. Draven stood over the corpse, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. The battle around him faded into a dull roar, the world narrowing to just him and the dead warlord at his feet. "Captain," one of the surviving knights called, his voice crackling over the comms. "The way is clear. We've breached the inner sanctum." Draven looked up, his gaze hard, unyielding. "Move out," he ordered. There was no time for rest, no time for mourning. The fight wasn't over yet. And so they moved deeper into the heart of darkness, their blades still dripping with blood, their resolve as unbreakable as iron. The inside of the citadel was a nightmare come to life. The walls were alive, pulsing with a sickly green light that made the shadows dance like something alive. The air was thick and humid, filled with the stench of rot and decay. Every breath Draven took tasted foul, like he was breathing in the last gasps of a dying world. The Iron Knights moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the organic muck that squelched beneath their boots. They were deep in enemy territory now, and every sense was on high alert. The Xal'kath were waiting for them, hidden in the shadows, watching with those cold, inhuman eyes. Draven could feel the weight of their stares, the hate radiating off them like heat from a fire. They knew what was coming, and they were ready to die to stop it. Draven's grip tightened on his sword, his knuckles white beneath the armored gauntlet. If the aliens wanted to die, he'd be more than happy to oblige. "Keep moving," he ordered, his voice low and steady in the comms. The knights followed, their swords raised, ready for the ambush they knew was coming. It didn't take long. The first Xal'kath lunged from the shadows, its blade a blur of motion. Draven sidestepped the strike, his sword coming up in a quick, vicious arc. The blade connected with the alien's neck, and its head flew off in a spray of black ichor, the body collapsing to the floor in a twitching heap. "Contact," someone shouted, and then all hell broke loose. The Xal'kath poured out of the walls, a tide of chitin and claws, their eyes burning with an unnatural light. The narrow corridor filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the shriek of alien war cries, the wet, sickening thud of flesh being torn apart. Draven moved like a machine, his sword a blur of deadly motion. Every strike was precise, efficient, cutting down one Xal'kath after another. There was no finesse, no wasted effort, just the brutal, bloody reality of close-quarters combat. His blade cleaved through an alien's chest, the energy-infused edge slicing through chitin and muscle like it was nothing. The Xal'kath screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed off the walls, and Draven kicked the dying creature aside, stepping over its twitching body without a second thought. The corridor was a slaughterhouse, bodies piling up as the Iron Knights carved their way through the horde. The floor was slick with blood, some of it black and alien, some of it red and human. Draven didn't stop, didn't let himself think about the men falling around him, their death cries cut off by the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. As Xal'kath lunged at him, its blade aiming for his throat. Draven caught the strike with his sword, the impact reverberating up his arm. The alien snarled, pushing back with surprising strength, but Draven held firm, his muscles straining against the pressure. With a grunt, he shoved the Xal'kath back, then brought his sword down in a brutal, overhead strike. The blade split the alien's skull in half, and Draven felt the resistance give as the sword bit deep into the creature's brain. It dropped like a sack of meat, and Draven pulled his blade free with a sickening squelch. "Keep pushing," he barked, wiping the alien ichor off his visor with the back of his hand. "We've got to reach the inner sanctum." The knights pressed on, their formation tightening as the corridor narrowed. The Xal'kath were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood, every step forward a struggle against the tide. Draven's muscles burned, his body screaming for rest, but he pushed the pain aside. There was no room for weakness here, no room for hesitation. This was what they'd trained for, what they'd come here to do. The corridor opened up into a large chamber, the walls lined with pulsating organic matter, the floor slick with blood and alien viscera. At the center of the chamber stood the Xal'kath warlord, its massive form towering over the dead and dying. Draven's breath caught in his throat as he locked eyes with the creature. It was a monster, a living nightmare, its body covered in thick, chitinous armor, its eyes burning with a cold, calculating intelligence. It held a massive, serrated blade in its clawed hands, the edge dripping with fresh blood. The warlord let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. Draven felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't let it show. He tightened his grip on his sword, his eyes narrowing in determination. "Take it down," he ordered, and the knights moved as one, their blades raised. The warlord met them with a roar, its blade slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Draven barely managed to parry the strike, the impact nearly knocking him off his feet. The force of the blow sent a shockwave up his arm, but he gritted his teeth and held his ground. The warlord was a beast, its strikes heavy and relentless. It fought with a kind of savage grace, every movement calculated, every blow meant to kill. Draven ducked beneath a wild swing, his sword flashing out to slash at the creature's exposed side. The blade connected, cutting deep, and the warlord howled in pain, black ichor spraying from the wound. But the alien didn't go down. It turned on Draven with a snarl, its eyes blazing with fury. Draven barely had time to react before the warlord's blade was coming at him again, a blur of serrated metal. He twisted out of the way, the blade missing him by inches, but the warlord was relentless, pressing the attack. Draven's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles screaming in protest, but he didn't back down. He met the warlord's strikes with his own, their blades clashing in a shower of sparks. The chamber echoed with the sounds of their battle, the noise almost deafening. The warlord was bigger, stronger, but Draven was faster, more precise. He fought with the cold, calculated precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. Every strike was aimed to kill, every movement meant to end this once and for all. Finally, Draven saw his opening. The warlord raised its blade for a killing blow, leaving its chest exposed. Draven didn't hesitate. He drove his sword forward with all his strength, the blade punching through the alien's thick armor and into its heart. The warlord let out a strangled cry, its body shuddering as the life drained out of it. Draven twisted the blade, feeling the satisfying crunch of bone beneath his grip, and then yanked it free. The warlord staggered, its eyes wide with shock, before it collapsed to the ground, dead. Draven stood over the corpse, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Around him, the remaining Xal'kath were falling back, their morale shattered by the death of their leader. The chamber was littered with bodies, the floor a slick, bloody mess. "Captain," one of the surviving knights called, his voice crackling over the comms. "We've breached the inner sanctum." Draven nodded, wiping the blood and sweat from his face. "Good," he said, his voice rough, worn down to the bone. "But this isn't over. Get ready for the final push." The knights regrouped, their faces grim, their eyes filled with the knowledge that the worst was yet to come. Draven took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. They were deep in the heart of the enemy now, surrounded on all sides by death and destruction. But Draven didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. They would see this through to the end, no matter the cost. And if they had to wade through hell to do it, so be it. The heart of the citadel was a dark, pulsing nightmare. The walls throbbed with a sick, greenish light, the organic matter woven through the metal structure oozing like open wounds. The air was thick, almost choking, filled with the stench of decay and something worse, something that gnawed at the edges of Draven's mind. This place was alive, and it wanted them dead. Draven pushed forward, his breath heavy inside his helmet, his muscles aching from the endless fighting. They'd cut through the Xal'kath hordes to get here, lost good men along the way. Now it was just him and the few Iron Knights still standing. They were covered in blood, some of it theirs, most of it not, and their armor was battered, barely holding together. But they were still moving, still fighting. Eyes up, Draven rasped into the comms, his voice a harsh whisper. "We're almost there." The corridor narrowed, funneling them into a large, cavernous chamber. The hive nexus. Draven had heard the stories, seen the briefings, but nothing could have prepared him for this. The nexus was a massive, pulsating mass at the center of the chamber, a tangle of biotech and alien flesh that seemed to be breathing, living. It was surrounded by twisted machinery, wires and tubes snaking out from the walls, feeding the thing that controlled the entire Xal'kath swarm. The walls pulsed in time with the nexus, the whole place beating like a giant, diseased heart. Draven felt a shiver run down his spine. This was it. The source of all the death, all the pain. The thing that had driven the Xal'kath to destroy entire worlds, to slaughter billions. And they were here to kill it. "Stay sharp," he muttered. "It's not going to go down easy." The knights spread out, their swords raised, their eyes scanning the chamber for any sign of movement. But the nexus didn't attack. It didn't send its drones after them. It just waited. Draven took a step forward, his sword humming with energy. Every instinct screamed at him to get this over with, to cut the thing down and be done with it. But something held him back, a nagging feeling deep in his gut. Then the Overmind spoke. The voice wasn't a sound, not exactly. It was more like a pressure in his skull, a low, thrumming pulse that vibrated through his bones. It wasn't words, not in any language Draven knew, but he understood the meaning all the same. "You think you can stop us?" it said, the voice cold, emotionless. "You think you can kill what cannot die?" Draven tightened his grip on his sword. "We've killed plenty of you already," he muttered. "You're just next in line." The Overmind laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that shook the walls. "You've killed the body, not the mind. The Xal'kath are eternal. We are legion, and you are nothing." Draven didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. "You don't get it," he said, his voice low, deadly. "We're not here to talk." And with that, he charged. The Overmind responded in kind. The nexus pulsed, and the walls came alive, spewing out Xal'kath drones by the dozens. They swarmed towards the Iron Knights, their eyes glowing with the same sickly light as the Nexus, their bodies moving with a speed and ferocity that spoke of desperation. But Draven didn't slow down. His sword cut through the first drone like it was paper, the blade humming with energy. The alien shrieked, its body collapsing into a heap of twitching limbs. He kept moving, his focus narrowed to a razor's edge. He didn't care about the drones, didn't care about the blood and the screams. All that mattered was the Nexus, the heart of the beast. The knights fought beside him, their swords flashing in the dim light, their movements a blur of lethal precision. They were outnumbered, surrounded on all sides, but they didn't falter. Each one of them knew what was at stake. They knew they weren't coming out of this alive. But that was fine. They'd come here to end it, and that's what they'd do. Draven reached the Nexus, his sword crackling with energy. The Overmind lashed out, a tendril of biotech whipping towards him, but he was ready. He ducked under the strike and drove his blade deep into the heart of the Nexus, the impact sending a shockwave through his body. The Nexus screamed, a high-pitched wail that made Draven's head spin, but he didn't let go. He pushed the sword deeper, feeling the resistance give, feeling the thing die beneath his hands. The drones went wild, their attacks becoming frantic, disorganized. The knights cut them down, one after another, their blades drenched in alien blood. But it wasn't enough. There were too many. Draven yanked his sword free and turned, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The Nexus was dying, its light fading, but the drones weren't stopping. If anything, they were coming faster, more desperate. "Fall back," he shouted, but it was too late. The knights were falling, one by one, their bodies disappearing under a tide of claws and fangs. Draven felt a surge of anger, of rage, but there was nothing he could do. The Nexus was dead, but so were his men. A drone leaped at him, its claws tearing at his armor. He spun, his sword slicing through the alien's chest, but more took its place. He fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur of motion, his body a wall of pain and exhaustion. And then it was over. The last drone fell, its body crumpling to the ground in a heap of twitching limbs. The chamber was silent, the air thick with the smell of blood and death. Draven stood in the middle of it all, his breath ragged, his body trembling with exhaustion. The Nexus was dead, its light gone, its voice silenced. He was alone. Draven looked around, his heart heavy. The knights were gone, their bodies lying still on the blood-soaked floor. They'd done it. They'd won, but at what cost? The pain hit him then, sharp and sudden, his body giving out beneath the weight of it all. He dropped to his knees, his sword clattering to the ground beside him. His vision blurred, the edges of the world going dark. But he didn't care. They'd done it. They'd ended the Xal'kath, stopped the threat. It was over. Draven let out a shuddering breath, his body sagging with relief. He'd done what he'd come here to do. The cost had been high, too high, but it was done. And then, with a final ragged breath, he let the darkness take him.